Imagine waking up with the sun, not to an alarm, but to the shrill cries of birds echoing through an ancient forest, and the faint crackle of dying embers from last night's fire. But the truth is more grounded, more human, and far more intense. It shifted with the seasons and the sun. In winter, days were shorter and harsher. Animal tracks, broken branches, fresh droppings, any of these could mean a predator passed through. Did someone hear wolves? Were there unfamiliar human footprints? Territory mattered, and so did silence. Your people slept light. Most adult men organized hunting parties early in the morning, depending on the region. They didn't just grab spears and run blindly into the woods. You couldn't waste anything. The meat was cleaned and often smoked or dried. If you lost your knife, you didn't just go without. You were defenseless. Storytelling passed on knowledge of which plants cured sickness, which caves held spirits, which animals circled at night. Children didn't learn from books. They learned from firelight. Songs, rhythms, carved objects, painted walls, all part of the same need to remember and teach. Because seasons change, resources shift. Someone gets sick, someone gets injured. A child goes missing, new animal tracks appear. Or maybe, worst of all, you spot another group nearby, unfamiliar people with painted faces, sharp eyes, and silence that means either trade or blood. Cavemen didn't live static lives. They were reactive, alert, and endlessly adaptable. They weren't just surviving, they were innovating, organizing, even dreaming. Elders, though fewer in number, were valued as living libraries. A woman who knew how to bind a wound or treat a fever might be the difference between life and death for an entire band. Flaking new blades from stone, binding wooden handles with sinew or resin, sharpening bone points. These weren't hobbies. They were survival crafts, and each generation refined them. The tools weren't crude. They were optimized over thousands of years, each shape serving a purpose. An Ice Age scraper looked different from a tropical harpoon because every environment shaped its humans, and every human shaped their tools in return. The hide was scraped clean to be turned into clothing, bedding, or ropes. Bones became tools, jewelry, or needles. Fat was rendered for cooking or even waterproofing. Organs were eaten quickly. It was both feast and sacred ritual. Nothing died without being honored in some way. Even the act of sharing the meat became a social glue. Who got the best cut, who helped the most, who shared with the sick. These were strategic missions. Hunters observed the migration patterns of animals, seasonal behaviors, watering holes, and nesting spots. They studied footprints like detectives, noticing shifts in herd movement or subtle changes in the landscape. Spears, hand axes, throwing sticks, they all had to be ready. The fire had to be watched. The wind changed. Sometimes a distant howl froze everyone in place. Sometimes you moved camp in the middle of the night because the scent of death was in the air, rotting meat, wet fur, something circling. Some people always slept lightly, hands near weapons. Others took shifts. The group moved as one organism, aware that danger didn't wait for morning. Some groups even used early traps or drove animals toward natural cliffs or rivers where escape was difficult. It wasn't brute strength that got the kill. It was teamwork and knowledge passed down like treasure. You were always halfway alert, halfway in survival mode. Women played an equally vital role, and the idea that they stayed behind doing nothing is just plain wrong. Women gathered nuts, fruits, roots, herbs, and small animals. In many regions, their gathering supplied more calories than hunting did. They had encyclopedic knowledge of which berries were edible, which tubers required boiling to remove toxins, and when certain plants would flower. They used sharpened sticks to dig, carried woven baskets or skins, and sometimes hunted small game like hares or birds. Children, too, learned by watching pointing out edible plants, helping carry bundles, and slowly learning what life demanded. You didn't wake up to ease into the day, you woke up to secure it. In summer, the heat pushed activity into the early morning and late evening. Fetching water could mean an encounter with a crocodile, a snake, or another tribe. You'd carry it back in carved wood vessels, animal skins, or even large leaves. The group always needed more than it thought. You'd need it for cooking, cleaning wounds, cooling down, boiling plants, or just surviving the heat. Every drop had purpose. There was no such thing as waste. In most parts of the world, the first task was always checking the fire. Fire was everything warmth, light, protection, and cooked food. It didn't just comfort. It kept away the dark things with teeth. Most groups didn't start fire from scratch every morning. They carried embers from camp to camp, wrapped in dried moss or bark, breathing life into them when it was time to cook or huddle close. Losing fire could mean death. It wasn't a tool. It was salvation. Cavemen, really, early Homo sapiens, and their predecessors were people like us, shaped by an unforgiving world. They lived without calendars, clocks, or written language, but their days were full of action, risk, planning, and meaning. For them, every single hour had weight. Waking up meant confronting hunger. It meant strategizing. Where's the water? How much food is left? Do the tools need fixing? Has the weather shifted? Is there danger nearby? If you're not paying attention, you die. That's the rhythm of Paleolithic life. Your bedding isn't a mattress, but a pile of dried grass and animal hides. The cold bites your skin, and the scent of smoke, sweat, and damp earth fills your nose before you even open your eyes. You sit up slowly, not because you're tired from a late Netflix binge or scrolling through TikTok, but because you're alive another day, and that means you've won a battle against predators, disease, the cold, and starvation. You're a Paleolithic human, and survival is your full-time job. The idea of what cavemen did all day might conjure cartoonish images of grunting men with clubs or awkward fire-making scenes in kids' books. A typical day didn't unfold in hours blocked out for meetings or screen time. The first waking moments were about scanning the surroundings. You wouldn't know what doom scrolling is, but you would absolutely know the feeling of scanning for threats. Water came next. Most camps were built near reliable water sources, streams, rivers, springs, but these weren't always safe. Food was the backbone of every decision. Without food, you grew weak, and weakness was a death sentence. But it wasn't just men with weapons who provided food. Afternoons were quieter, but not idle. If the group had a successful hunt, it was time to prepare the animal. Butchering was brutal, bloody, and necessary. Tool maintenance took up entire chunks of time. Every cutting edge dulled. Every spear broke. Tools weren't disposable. They were personal and essential. As evening approached, the community came together again. The fire was stoked, food shared, stories told. This wasn't just downtime. It was survival, too. Even sleep wasn't simple. And the next day, it would be almost the same. But not exactly. Even in a world without clocks, the year had a rhythm that every member of the group could feel in their bones. As spring crept over the land, birds returned, rivers swelled with melted snow, and the air smelled of wet soil and fresh growth. This was a time of abundance, but also of planning. Some animals came out of hibernation, lean and slow easier prey. Certain mushrooms could be dried, fruits preserved, meat smoked. Coal seeped into bone and ash, and food grew scarce. These people lived in small groups, yes, but they weren't isolated. They met others sometimes to trade, sometimes to intermarry, sometimes to fight. Some believed the moon was a god. Others whispered to the fire or carved animals into cave walls as offerings. They buried their dead in fetal positions, believing in a return to the womb of the earth. Some painted their bodies with ash and ochre, wore feathers and bones not just for decoration, but for power, identity, protection. When a child was born, it was a miracle. When someone died, the group mourned. They didn't have rituals we recognize, but they had rituals. Grief didn't need language. It needed time and a circle of people who stayed close and sang the old songs. Archaeological sites show stone materials that originated hundreds of miles away, suggesting large networks of exchange. They knew the land in a way we've forgotten. They understood how the sun shifted, when birds would leave, what tree would crack before a storm. They woke up, listened to the world, and tried to stay alive. They worked, hunted, gathered, built, taught, remembered. They carved tools, told stories, raised children, honored the dead, and sang songs to things they couldn't explain. They failed, they learned, they adapted, and in doing so, they laid the foundation for everything we take for granted today. Not with temples or skyscrapers, but with hands calloused from stone and hearts shaped by firelight. They didn't farm, but they managed landscapes, burning fields to bring new growth, tracking animal migrations, leaving seeds behind in patterns that helped them find food later. They didn't write poetry, but their cave paintings show motion, story, wonder. The image of a bison, drawn with charcoal and red clay, horns lowered, legs blurred in a run, that's not random. That's the memory of a hunt. That's art with teeth. That shiny red rock you wore around your neck, someone carried it for weeks to trade it for meat or tools. The tools they made, the strategies they used, the way they taught their young, it was all built on intelligence honed by constant threat. If anything, they were sharper. They had to be. There was no room for distraction, no second chances. You didn't need a phone to be connected. You needed awareness of the weather, the soil, the body beside you breathing softly in the dark. Relationships between bands were delicate. A shared meal could forge peace. A stolen child could ignite generations of feuding. But even conflict was managed. Some injuries on ancient skeletons show healed fractures, evidence of restraint and recovery, not just bloodshed. Some groups migrated, others dug in. Fires burned hotter. Bodies pressed together under furs, sharing warmth. Hunger was constant. You'd eat whatever you had. Dried meat, stored roots, fish buried in ice. Children cried at night, not from nightmares, but because their bellies ached and their feet were numb. You learned not to cry back, you just held them closer. The days were shorter, the nights endless. Yet this was also the time for stories. When outside was deadly, the inside of a shelter became a stage. Elders told tales of old hunts, ancestors, spirits that lived in stone and fire. Someone drummed a hollow log. Someone else hummed a tune passed down for generations. It wasn't entertainment, it was identity, a way to keep your soul warm when your body was failing. Caves became pantries. Large flat rocks were used to grind seeds into meal, and pits were dug to keep perishables cool. It wasn't agriculture, but it was knowledge passed down like sacred scripture. Wounds were cleaned with plant extracts. Fever was treated with teas. Bones were splintered with sticks and bound with sinew. Some of them lived into their 50s or 60s, a long life back then, and the signs of arthritis and wear tell the story of bodies that worked hard but didn't give up. And when someone couldn't hunt anymore, they weren't discarded. In many graves, we find elders buried with care tools placed beside them, bodies positioned gently, ochre smeared across their bones. That's not survival instinct. That's love. Young ones learn what not to eat by watching the older ones. A mistake meant vomiting, pain, or death. Those who survived knew the signs. They marked them with gestures, songs, even crude symbols carved into trees or bones. A berry that killed had a name. A root that healed a fever had a shape they never forgot. Edible plants began to sprout, and the group knew exactly when to move to take advantage of them. There was no calendar, no Google reminders, just accumulated wisdom. They remembered that after the first rains, the tubers grew near the bend in the river. They remembered that certain insects swarmed for only a week and could be collected in baskets for roasting. They knew that elk would migrate, and if they weren't in place before the herd moved, they'd miss the year's best chance at meat. Every movement had urgency. Every decision had echoes. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat could be unforgiving, especially without modern clothes or shelter. Midday often became a time of rest, not out of laziness, but survival. Activity slowed, but it never stopped. Shade became sacred. Tree canopies, caves, or hides stretched over sticks created temporary relief. Children played with sticks and stones, yes, but their games were practice. Mock hunts, pretend foraging, mimicking the older ones with clumsy confidence. They weren't being babysat, they were being prepared. During summer, rivers sometimes dried up. The group might need to migrate, carrying everything they had: tools, fire, food, memories. Babies strapped to backs, elders helped along. They walked for hours through open plains or dense forest, always alert, always evaluating. A wrong move could mean no water, no food, or an ambush from another band. But they moved together, a living organism shaped by experience. Fall was a time of frenzy. Everyone worked harder. This was the season of storing. You didn't survive winter unless you prepared. Winter was brutal. It stripped life down to its core. Their social lives were more complex than we give them credit for. What about their health? They didn't have hospitals, but they weren't helpless either. Their spiritual world was just as real as ours, though without churches or books. Despite the hardship, Paleolithic humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving in their own way. Their minds were no less capable than ours. So what did cavemen actually do all day? It's easy to think of the past as something primitive, to look at flint tools and fire pits and assume that life was crude. But what Paleolithic humans lacked in convenience, they made up for with innovation, endurance, and intuition. Every moment of their lives was spent solving problems we can't even imagine. You complain when your phone dies. They built entire lives in places where a single mistake meant actual death. They didn't fear the wild. They knew the value of a warm fire, a shared meal, a safe place to sleep. They didn't have goals. They had the next day, the next hunt, the next shelter. And somehow, over tens of thousands of years, they laid down the entire foundation of what it means to be human. They lived inside of it, reading its signals and responding with quiet, daily acts of genius. They crafted the first instruments, invented the first tools, spoke the first words, and held each other through the darkest nights without hope of rescue. They carried fire across ice fields. They raised children in caves. They stitched together clothing with bone and sinew. Not in one grand act, but in 1,000 quiet ones. They didn't have Google, but they could find a rabbit in the blizzard. They didn't have pharmacies, but they knew which plant could stop bleeding and which leaf would make you hallucinate. They didn't have universities, but but they knew how to survive floods, wildfires, predators, and winter, and they passed that knowledge on one day at a time for nearly 2.5 million years, and their legacy didn't stop when the Stone Age ended. It flowed forward into us. Every tool we use, every language we speak, every shared meal, every story told around a fire, it all traces back to them, to the unnamed men and women who figured out how to take bone, wood, fire, and grit and turn it into something that could carry us forward. A world that harsh doesn't break people unless they forget why they're fighting. They found joy in a successful hunt, in the first sign of spring, in a child's first steps. They had no Instagram posts or status updates, but when someone returned safely from a hunt or caught a rare fish or sang a new melody, you can bet the entire group knew about it. Community wasn't a choice. It was everything. They weren't waiting for the future. They were making it. Without factories, without electricity, without writing. They passed knowledge through calloused hands and whispered stories, shaping minds that would one day build pyramids, fly planes, and walk on the moon. But here's the thing, they didn't just give us survival. They gave us wonder. When they looked up at the stars, they didn't shrug. They imagined. They sang. They gave names to light and darkness, and carved meaning out of mystery. They made music from bones, danced until they collapsed from laughter or fatigue, and painted animals in flickering caves just to remember, just to say, we were here. They didn't have history books, so they made history with their hands. And for all the struggle, there was joy. There had to be. They didn't think in years or decades. They thought in seasons and migrations and survival cycles, but they lived fully. So when someone calls them just cavemen, remind them of this: these people crossed frozen continents without maps. What did cavemen actually do all day? They woke up, they read the world, and they built the beginning of everything. They lived.